Hey class, welcome back for part 2 of the material for Thursday, April 16th, which I'm not even going to bother to put up until Friday because you're midterming on Thursday and the Lord knows how you're going to be able to focus on anything like a lecture from me or two. God help you. Who made this schedule anyway? But here is the other material for tonight, and I'm just going to point out that I decided to shave in between the lectures. That just wasn't working for me. When we left off last time, it was that sort of weird, crazy time, the era of good feelings, which took place after the War of 1812, which pretty much exploded the idea that the Federalists were a real thing. Their position on the War of 1812 looked really bad after the Battle of New Orleans. That made everyone think that it had been a big American victory. So after that, it was all Republicans, and then they started doing some pretty weird stuff, acting like Federalists after the Federalists were gone. So, weird moments, basically a decade in American history where there was just one political group, and it couldn't last forever. And as is typically the way these things go, it took an election to really begin to bring politics back to something a little bit more approaching the way the politics usually goes, which is conflict. Specifically, the election of 1824, very complicated election with just one political party, one political group. There wasn't any way to narrow down the candidates. And so what wound up happening was candidates from different parts of the country ran hoping to get support in their part of the country and then maybe pick up some extra votes in the other parts of the country. And so there were four major candidates for president in 1824. They were Andrew Jackson, he's from Tennessee, and of course is the big hero of the Battle of New Orleans, and we're going to be hearing a lot more about him. Then there was William Crawford. William Crawford is from Georgia. Then there is John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams is, of course, the son of the previous president, John Adams. And he is Secretary of State in the current administration under James Monroe. And then, last but not least, is our friend Henry Clay, who, of course, is the great compromiser, the youngest Speaker of the House ever, and the dominant guy in Congress at that time. Clay is from Kentucky. So, as it turns out, because the election was so divided, Andrew Jackson got the most votes, the most popular votes, and the most electoral votes, but did not get a majority. Now, the Constitution has ways to deal with this. Specifically, what happens is if there is no majority in the Electoral College, then the House of Representatives chooses among the top three. Now, as it turns out, the order that I just listed them, I got them a little bit out of order. It was actually Jackson, then Adams, then Crawford, then Clay. But the key thing is that Clay, he came in fourth, which meant that he was no longer eligible to be elected president because House of Representatives is going to pick from the top three. But Henry Clay basically runs the House of Representatives, which puts him in a very, very useful position in terms of being a kingmaker. So, when the House of Representatives decided among the top three, and in reality it was clear it was just going to be between Jackson, who got the most votes, and John Quincy Adams, who got the second most votes, Crawford in between had a stroke, and so he was basically not really a legitimate, viable candidate anymore. When it came down to it, the supporters of Jackson assumed that he would win because he got the most votes, including votes not just in his section of the country, but the House of Representatives instead chose as the president after the election of 1824 John Quincy Adams, the guy who had come in second. All of Jackson's supporters are outraged. They are convinced that there had been that their candidate had been in some way just sort of hosed. And those feelings became more magnified not long after John Quincy Adams was sworn in. Who did he choose as his Secretary of State? Which, by the way, now the previous 4 presidents in a row have had that job before getting to be president. Who did he pick to be Secretary of State, the most important position in the cabinet? None other than Henry Clay. So it looked to all the Jackson supporters like there had been some sort of a deal. It looked as if Jackson got frozen out by these two guys. Clay allowed John Quincy Adams to be president, and in exchange got this important job, a stepping stone job that would then let him be president someday. And Clay, of course, really does want to be president someday, so that's not such a crazy idea. So supporters of Andrew Jackson railed against what they considered to be the corrupt bargain between John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay. Now, the truth is that as far as we know, there was no such bargain. And knowing what we know about the personalities involved, there's really no way that John Quincy Adams, who was as morally upright as you could possibly find in politics, there's no way that he would have been involved in any such sort of a deal. So the bargain itself really probably never happened. However, the existence of the belief in the bargain, sometimes beliefs are stronger than reality, especially when it comes to politics. Now, I can say that Clay did pick John Quincy Adams. He was instrumental in making John Quincy Adams president, and that was based on his own political calculations. First of all, of the major candidates, John Quincy Adams was closest to Henry Clay philosophically. Andrew Jackson and William Crawford both believed in a more limited role for the government and didn't support the American system, but John Quincy Adams did. So Henry Clay is looking for an ally who can help lead the country in the direction that he wants, and Adams is closer to him. Um, Also, he's thinking about region and thinking that politics is going to be sort of a local thing. Given that Clay is from Kentucky, which is sort of the West and sort of the South at that point, what he was hoping to do was position himself that he could be the leading candidate of the West in particular, and he thought the way to do that was he needed to get Andrew Jackson out of the picture. Jackson hadn't really been a politician before. He'd been a military man, and so Clay was assuming that Jackson would get this one shot, it wouldn't work out, and then after that he would sort of fade away. He miscalculated grievously there, and in fact, Clay and Jackson became mortal enemies as a result of the way that Clay basically froze Jackson out of the presidency. Jackson and all of his supporters are convinced that Clay is as corrupt as they come, and they include John Quincy Adams in that description. As I said, no real corrupt bargain probably existed, but it doesn't really matter because the discussion of it, the wild talk that there was a corrupt bargain, basically destroyed any legitimacy that John Quincy Adams had as president. Adams and Clay did try to get Congress to push through some more things along the lines of the American system, but they didn't get very far. And in fact, being associated with Henry Clay made some of those ideas of the American system start to fade away as policy ideas that could get anywhere. And within a few years, it became clear that John Quincy Adams was just has such illegitimacy surrounding him. It's sort of a where there's smoke, there's fire kind of a thing for the poor guy. And his presidency is really a doomed presidency, one he can't really accomplish anything. It hurt him, and it hurt Henry Clay more than it hurt Andrew Jackson, who went back to Tennessee in the intervening years, and a lot of people sort of treated him as if he should be president, and they're waiting around for their chance to give him what he had deserved, they thought, in 1824, which is to get into the White House. So, in 1828, there's a rematch. This time, the other candidates are not in the picture. John Quincy Adams is defending the presidency, but Andrew Jackson, who a lot of people thought should have been president in the first place, won quite easily. And so this is Andrew Jackson's big moment in the sun. And the title of the lecture is The Age of Jackson, because he is really a defining figure for this period. Some talk about Jackson first before we get into some of the specific things of him. He was born in Virginia, but really lived most of his adult life out west. And he is the first president to come from the West, which in those days, you don't have to get that far from where we are now to be the West. He had spent most of his adult life, his career, in Tennessee when he wasn't in the Army. Tennessee doesn't seem like it's that far away, but that was the West. And it was compared to the older parts of the country, the more settled parts of the country. The West was sort of a place like Tennessee was sort of a wild, it appeared almost unmannered, rough kind of a place. And Jackson represented that in many ways, not just because of his military background, but because of the life he had led. He had been involved in duels, multiple duels. To his dying day, he's got parts of bullets lodged in his body because sometimes when you're dueling, you may win, but you may still the other guy gets his licks in. And he used to, when the weather would turn bad, he would say, "Oh, I felt that in my elbow," and show them, a little piece of the bullet was lodged in his elbow. He had lived a life like that. He's got a fierce temper. He's a tough guy, and he represents sort of a new kind of American that's really not like any of the previous presidents and not like any real national figure prior to this. He is described as the common man incarnate, which is to say that the regular Joe Blow American has finally found their champion. But it's very easy to dismiss him intellectually, which a lot of his political opponents tended to do to their error. He is quite smart. He is well educated. He is, in addition to being a man of the military, he's a trained lawyer. He is a wealthy plantation owner. Has a large plantation in Tennessee, which is now a national place that you can go visit. It's a park, um, and was a big slave owner out west and also was quite shrewd politically and a brilliant writer. He really had more than just the common touch, but the perception people had of him was that he had the common touch. Now, as he was running for president first in 1824 and then successfully in 1828, he made very clear that his hero was Thomas Jefferson. And like Jefferson, he believed in a limited federal government, focused more on states' rights, and believed that the government should do less, especially with regards to getting involved in the economy. Didn't really like what he saw during the era of good feelings when the Republicans had sort of expanded what the government did. He felt that this was a terrible mistake. Um, Jackson also presents himself as a man of his region. And in this case, he's really a man of two regions. He is a Southerner. Tennessee is a southern state, of course. And that means he's a slave owner. And he made no bones about that. He's a rich plantation owner. He has hundreds of slaves working for him, slaving away for no pay, with horrible living conditions and all the terrible things that come with being a slave. It didn't really bother him in the slightest. He thought that that was the way the world was supposed to be. And therefore, he is going to, as he gets into politics, support the Southern slave owner, and Southern slave owners support him. But he's also a man of the West. As I said, Tennessee is the West in those days, and that's not just because he gets involved in these duels and he's sort of a tough guy who's ready to fight at the moment's notice. He's also a man of the West because he represents one of the ideas that people on the frontier, and again, Tennessee was the frontier in those days, that they are pushing for, and that is to say that many of the people on the frontier in the 1800s felt toward Native Americans the way people on the frontier had felt at the time of Bacon's Rebellion, which was that they hated them. Um, and that's essentially because people on the frontier are the white people who've gone farthest into Native American territory and are then fighting with the Native American people who live there and have lived there for generations, if not hundreds of years, over that land. And therefore, people in the West, the white frontiersmen, they're arch enemies, the people who they consider to be in the way of progress, and the people who they consider to be their enemies, the people that they're fighting with. They would just despise to a man the Native Americans, and that was how Jackson felt as well. Jackson, in his military career, had not just fought against the British in the War of 1812, but he had also fought against Native American tribes in a number of smaller scale engagements in the years after the War of 1812, and had a true distaste, just an utter disliking for Native American people in general. We'll hear more about how that played out in the next lecture. But whenever he talks about Native Americans, it is disparagingly, and that is a thing that's going to get him votes, I'm sorry to say, among the Western states, because most Western frontiersmen feel likewise about the Native Americans, a real hatred. And of course, the Native Americans frequently feel the same, because these are the people who are taking their land away. So that's where the conflict is. So Jackson is a man of the South. He's a man of the West. He's a man inspired by Thomas Jefferson. And so we get a pretty good idea of who he is there. But another way of unpacking his ideas is to look at what he stood for officially. And so for that, you can look to his campaign when he ran in 1828. He ran in 1824. That one didn't work out. In 1828, the time that he won, his slogan, which summarizes his political philosophy, it doesn't exactly kind of roll off the tongue, but it is the slogan, and it's going to help us understand him. Jackson's slogan that they put on the Jackson buttons, it was reform, recovery, and retrenchment. At least it's alliterative. So when Jackson and Jackson supporters say reform, they mean political reform. And what they're really referring to is the corrupt bargain. Jackson and his supporters believed that the corruption of John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay was part of an overall corruption in Washington, D.C. And they were convinced that there was a political class, an elite political class, that was unfairly taking control of the country and making backroom deals like the so-called corrupt bargain that were not to the benefit of the regular people. So Jackson and his supporters hammered away at the need for reform. They're reminding everybody that their guy should have been elected the last time, but they're also saying it's not just good enough to elect Jackson. We need to get rid of all those people associated with this terrible, horrible crime that had been done against their candidate. So Jackson and his supporters focus on an idea that they call rotation in office, which to me sounds like you sit in a swivel chair and kind of spin around. But actually, the idea is that political jobs, offices in politics, that they shouldn't be permanent. What Jackson is calling for is that not only is he going to come in and get rid of John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay, but he is going to be a broom that will sweep out everyone in their administration and bring in all new people who would not have the same stench of corruption. And honestly, as far as he was concerned, the bureaucrats and other people in Washington, they shouldn't feel like they got to keep their jobs forever. They work for the people. They work at the pleasure of the president, and therefore they should accept the fact that when a new administration comes in, that they would bring in their own people. Now, this was sort of a new idea. There hadn't really been this sort of turnover that much previously. The idea that a president might fire people and want to bring in allies to work in government jobs, that was sort of unseemly. And so, opponents of Jackson said, well, you know, what you're saying is if you're going to fire people who work for the government and hire people after you fire them, then you're basically just creating jobs for your friends. And this doesn't sound like some sort of high minded, we're going to rotate out people and rotate in new ideas. It sounds like you're just going to reward people for being your political allies. And so opponents referred to rotation in office, this Jacksonian idea. They called it the spoils system. There's an old phrase: "To the victor goes the spoils," it sounds like what Jackson is talking about is just good old-fashioned political patronage, the sort of thing that kings used to do, and not something that's any particular high-minded idea. But Jackson is hammering away at the need for political reform. All right, then there's recovery, and by that he's referring to economic recovery. There had been that panic of 1819, not during John Quincy Adams' presidency, but during the previous president, James Monroe. And there were some lingering after effects of that, which concerned him. The biggest concern, though, is that Jackson was convinced that the Panic of 1819 was the fault of the banks, and especially the Bank of the United States, which he loathed. He personally, Jackson, had done very poorly, had lost a lot of money during the Panic of 1819, and afterwards never again trusted the Bank of the United States, which he directly blamed for the panic. Banks in general, which you could, if you want to, blame somebody. The banks are the things that had caused it. And he also didn't trust paper money, which you'll remember, basically banks issue paper money. He was convinced the only true money that could be trusted was gold and silver, specie as it's called. And anything else was just fake, was just sort of made up. So he doesn't trust any of those institutions. And when he's talking about recovery, what he's saying is we're going to make sure that a panic like that doesn't happen again. And his plan is, if he's elected president, is he's going to make sure that the banks can't meddle with the economy the way they had that had led to the Panic of 1819. Other economists would disagree with him and say that the banks are necessary and possibly maybe even made the Panic of 1819 not as bad. But he was convinced that the Bank of the United States was a destructive force, and he was out to get it. Then there is retrenchment. To retrench means to cut back. And specifically, what Jackson is calling for is a Jeffersonian ideal of a limited federal government. The government had expanded during the era of good feelings. Jackson had watched that in horror because he was convinced that his hero, Thomas Jefferson, would never have allowed that. Jefferson died, you'll remember, in 1826, so he's not around for us to ask him that. But the idea of a limited, Jeffersonian-style limited federal government had changed during the era of good feelings as the government expanded and as the Republicans tried to have the government do different things that they had never really cottoned to before. Well, here's Jackson saying those are all bad ideas for exactly the same reasons that Thomas Jefferson said those are bad ideas. The government shouldn't get too directly involved in the economy. The government shouldn't get too big because if it does, it's going to take away the rights of the people. Jackson has a very similar idea of what the government should do to his hero Thomas Jefferson, with one important exception. Jefferson believed in a limited federal government that, in general, didn't do very much. Jackson believed in a limited federal government that, in general, didn't do very much, but at the middle of it was a president who was going to be the most important part of the federal government. And it's going to turn out, when he is president, that although his ideas are Jeffersonian in some ways, his sense of the presidency is going to be very different. All right, so those three parts, reform, recovery, and retrenchment, help give us an idea of what he's going to be up to when he's elected president. It's a pretty boring little slogan, though, and doesn't really give you a flavor of just what a world-changing guy this President Jackson's going to be. He won very easily. It was not a particularly close election, and he took office in early 1829, sworn in the early days of 1829 in Washington, D.C., a place that previously, for the previous quarter century or so, had been a pretty stuffy place. Small, insular, just a few government offices. There's Congress in the Capitol on one side of Pennsylvania Avenue, and the president in the Executive Mansion, now officially renamed the White House around this time, partly as a result of what happened in the War of 1812, when it basically got burned down. They cleaned it up by just painting it white. And so people used to say, where's the president live? Oh, he lives in the White House up the street. But otherwise, Washington, D.C. is just it's a pretty quiet, boring, snobby kind of a place. And the presidents had taken their tip from people like Thomas Jefferson, where they're very quiet and they didn't do very much and they didn't lead very active social life and they're not these big personalities. Well, Andrew Jackson is a big personality and he's got a very different perception of who he is and also who he represents. So, as far as Jackson was concerned, his election was a chance for the real people of the country to get their say. He presented himself as essentially an outsider, someone who was going to come into D.C., come into Washington, clean up the corruption, throw out the crooks. This may sound familiar to you. And therefore, since Jackson believes that he is a force that is going to change Washington, D.C., he wanted all of his supporters to come there. And so he sent out a big invitation, just sort of wide open invitation. Anybody who wants to come, see me get sworn in, come to D.C., and we'll have what he called the People's Inauguration. Previously, when presidents got sworn in, it was very small, kind of quiet. There weren't big parades. The president would take the oath of office, give a little speech, go to the White House, move in, and sort of just get started on business. But Jackson turns it into a big event, and he's inviting all his supporters from all over the place to come, many of whom are coming from the less stuffy Western states. A lot of these people who come to Washington, D.C. have never been to a place like this before. They're sleeping in the streets because they can't afford a hotel room or because they just don't care to spend the money in a hotel room. They're spitting in the streets and their behavior is surprising and a little bit appalling to the more stuffy people who live in Washington and are going to have to get up and go to work the next day. To make matters worse, after he got sworn in, Jackson basically threw a huge party at the White House, and it's like a kegger. I mean, it's really this sort of big blowout that took place. The people's inauguration went crazy because all these folks who were Jackson supporters were very raucous and very excited about what was happening. A lot of them had had a lot to drink, and they all converged on the president's mansion, which is this large, impressive building, and they basically tore the place apart. There's this huge raging party that's going on. The place is more overstuffed than anyone has ever seen the building before. Um, Things get broken, things get stolen, windows get broken. It's so crowded at one point that a passerby who is walking by the White House and is sort of amazed by all the noise looks over and sees through with this one window in the White House. He can see that there's a room that's so crowded that people can't move. There's that many people there, and it's that big of a blowout. And he sees this one guy who's trying to get out, and finally the guy just jumps out the window and goes in the front door and tries again. And I don't know. I mean, it sounds like a frat party, is basically what it sounds like. And it sets the tone that Jackson's administration is going to be something that Washington, D.C. has never seen before. And really, the country has never seen before, because Jackson is a president that no one has ever seen before. The previous presidents, whether they were Massachusettsians like Adams and Adams, or whether they were Virginians, they came from sort of high society. They were educated, they were elites. Jackson is not like that. Although he is a brilliant guy, he's not well educated. And his supporters wouldn't really want somebody who's super well educated. They're looking for a guy who speaks like them. And so the people's inauguration is sort of the first sign of that. Now, Jackson has to make sure that then he can initiate these policies once he's president, which means he needs the right kind of advisors. Unfortunately, the people that Jackson appointed to the cabinet to help him run the country, to run the executive branch, most of them were terrible. His cabinet really was a big failure in the early days because he's trying to pick people like himself who are outsiders, who had very limited previous involvement in Washington or in the government, which meant that a lot of the people that he chose were in over their heads. There are a lot of scandals during Jackson's presidency because a lot of these cabinet members just really don't know what they're doing, and they got taken advantage of, or sometimes they did some dumb things themselves. One of the worst examples was the guy he chose to be the Secretary of War, which is in charge of the Army. The Army is not anywhere near as big as it is today, but it's still an important thing. And there's going to be regular government contracts that the Secretary of War has to sign. And contractors came and just basically pulled the wool over his eye multiple times. He signed these contracts for things that never really happened, and government money got paid for things that never got done. And there are all these scandals associated with the Army during John Eaton's Secretaryship of War, which is pretty bad. But that's not even the worst thing about John Eaton. John Eaton, the Secretary of War, wound up being the lightning rod around whom Jackson's cabinet basically fell apart in the early days of Jackson's administration. Not really John Eaton in this case, but the woman he brought back to Washington with him, his wife Peggy Eaton. The Eatons actually had been in Washington, D.C. a ways back in the early days of Washington when it was just getting started. You remember that I said that nobody really wants to come to Washington, D.C., especially in the early days. It's hot and it's remote and it's sort of a tiny little muddy burg, and nobody's particularly interested in being there. And so even the congressmen don't really want to be there. John Eaton had been a congressman in, a little ways back, and like most of the other congressmen, had shown up and hadn't really bothered to worry about anything fancy, and he just stayed in a boarding house. And then he fell in love with the daughter of the boarding house keeper, a young, vivacious woman named Peggy. And after John Eaton finished his single term in Congress, he hated it, and he left Washington, D.C., he thought for good, and he brought with him the daughter of the boarding house keeper, and they went off and got married, and she became Peggy Eaton. And he served in the Army, and he and Andrew Jackson became very good friends. And now, some years later, the Eatons are returning to Washington, D.C., and he's got this important job. But the thing is that for people in society, for the people who are the respectable people of Washington, the fact that the Secretary of War's wife, who is going to be a very important person in the city now, is someone who previously, when she lived in the city, had this fairly unrespectable position. She helped her father run this boarding house, which was a place where a bunch of single guys, or guys who were at least single for the moment, all lived together and had all these hijinks and got drunk and did dumb things and so forth. Um, and the impression that people have is that that's not a place for a woman. And in fact, in those days, if one wanted to cast aspersions on a woman's character, in addition to some of the words that are used today, and of course they are not words that any polite person would use, and you shouldn't. But one of the words, one of the phrases that someone might say is, "Your morals are no better than the daughter of a boarding house keeper," because the thought was that a woman in an environment where there's a bunch of guys would inevitably wind up doing things or being asked to do stuff that no respectable woman would do. Well, here's this supposedly not respectable woman who has come back to Washington, a place that she used to live in, and there's people living here who remember her in her much simpler and potentially less respectable days, and they just simply would not accept her. So the Eatons found themselves socially on the outs from the very beginning of the Jackson administration, which really shouldn't matter. As long as they can all work together, it shouldn't make the slightest bit of difference. But in the very early days of the Jackson administration, as they're just trying to get together, as they're just trying to begin to work together, a number of things happened that set a very bad tone and that effectively blew up the cabinet. So, in the early days of any administration, it's important for these people who don't usually know each other particularly well. Cabinet is putting together a cabinet, a team of advisors, requires a president to pull together people from different backgrounds, from different places, with different skills, and then to try to get them all to work together for the specific cabinet agencies they're working for, but also to work together as a team. And so, team building at the beginning of any administration is important. And so the less formal parts of the job sometimes are just as important. And in those days, what that really means is that the gatherings, the social gatherings, are important. And so traditionally, what would happen in the early parts of an administration is that there would be a series of events that would happen at various people in the administration's homes, and that would be a way for these cabinet members to get to know each other outside the lights of what was going on in official Washington. And so traditionally, this has sort of happened through the pecking order of the hierarchy of the administration. So the president would have a gathering, and then later the vice president would have a gathering, and then the secretary of state, and they work their way through the cabinet. And by the time they get to, I don't know, the postmaster general or whatever, then they all know each other pretty well. That's a few months into the beginning of the administration, and they have sort of figured out what their strengths and weaknesses are, and they know how to work together. Well, Jackson didn't throw that party, that traditional introductory event, because the theory of the time was that the men don't actually throw the party, but actually that their wives do. And Jackson was a widower; his wife was dead. So he doesn't throw the party because the assumption is that he can't, that it's not physically possible for a man to organize such a function. So that got passed on. The first official, unofficial gathering of the Jackson administration got passed on to his vice president, which really means that it got passed on to the vice president's wife. The vice president and his wife are the Calhouns. They're from South Carolina. They're from Charleston, South Carolina. They're from very upper class, stuffy society. The Calhouns have been in Washington for a while. They know their way around. Jackson and Calhoun don't really have much in common. They're both Southerners, but it turns out that they are temperamentally not that much in common. But they're stuck with each other. And as it turns out, Jackson's wife, when she made the guest list for the first real gathering of the Jackson administration, she simply couldn't bring herself to allow that woman into her home because she knew that Peggy Eaton carried with her this sort of scent of scandal, that she was really not of the quality, not of the class of woman that somebody like Mrs. Calhoun should allow in her home. And so the Calhouns left the Eatons off the guest list, and then the party happened. And Jackson is walking around, he's shaking hands, and he's saying, hey, Amos Kendall, how's it going? Hey, Martin Van Buren, what's going on? And then he realized that the Eatons, and he actually knows John Eaton, they'd been friends, that the Eatons aren't there, which puzzles him because why would the Eatons pass up this event? And he starts to ask around, and eventually somebody pulls him aside and says, well, Mrs. Calhoun, she wouldn't invite that woman. And Jackson doesn't know what they're talking about. So eventually they spelled out for him, that Mrs. Calhoun just won't allow the daughter of a boarding house keeper into her home. Jackson, like me, is kind of amazed that Mrs. Calhoun can be this snobby because her name is Fluoride, which to me, if your name is Fluoride, you should have a little bit more respect for other people. But anyway, um, Fluoride Calhoun and John Calhoun, her husband, they set the tone for this administration by snubbing the Eatons on day one. Jackson can't figure it out. It seems so ridiculous to him. Why would anybody care about what she had been back when she was younger? Secretary of War now, wife of the Secretary of War, respectable woman now. Who cares about her past? But then, as the other cabinet members worked their way through their turn to host a party, they all left the Eatons off as well. The wives of the other cabinet members were pretty scared of Fluoride Calhoun, and they saw that she had this power to snub and that she was very well connected to the elite high society of the city, and they were worried that if they invite the Eatons, that they would look bad, that they would look not classy, that they would look like they didn't know what they were doing, and that Fluoride Calhoun would just snub them too. So, as each of these events happened in the early weeks of the Jackson administration, the Eatons kept getting snubbed, which of course makes them very upset, but it also made Jackson very upset because he's supposed to be at all these events, and he goes and he looks around for the Eatons and he realizes that again they've been left off the guest list, and it makes him more and more angry. And he's angry for his friend John Eaton, but he's really angry for Peggy Eaton, who he is convinced is being treated very shabbily. Relevant to this story here is the way, and I mentioned that Jackson was a widower, is the way that Jackson's now deceased wife had been treated when Jackson had gotten into politics. So, quick story of Andrew Jackson. Jackson had married a much younger woman, much later in life than one normally does. He fell in love with a much younger woman, a widow named Rachel, whom he married out in Tennessee after he'd established himself as a rich plantation owner there. And they were very happily married. Jackson loved his wife Rachel, thought that she walked on water. Nothing bad could ever be said about her. Except that then they found out that her dead husband wasn't actually dead. What she had been told was that he basically had kind of left her and had gone out west to explore and to try to make a fortune, and then he was killed. And so the story that she had heard, that she had no reason not to believe, was that she was a widow, and so it was perfectly fine for her to marry this interesting general who is the hero of the Battle of New Orleans. I mean, come on, and he's got a bullet in his arm, so what else are they going to talk about? But then, lo and behold, after Jackson and Mrs. Jackson had been married for a while, they found out that actually her husband wasn't dead. He was just living somewhere out in the West, which meant that Jackson, when he married Rachel, he had made her a bigamist. And that's pretty embarrassing. So they had to track the guy down because he didn't know. They tracked the guy down and they got him to sign divorce papers, after which then the Jacksons are legally married. Stuff like this happens, especially out west where things are kind of loosey goosey. But when Jackson had run for president the first time in 1824, the corrupt bargain election, well, that led a lot of people to dig up this history of Rachel Jackson's past, and it got thrown all around in the newspapers. And people are saying all kinds of terrible things about Rachel Jackson, how she's a bigamist, how she's a loose woman, calling her all kinds of names, which infuriated Andrew Jackson because he can't believe that people are going after him by attacking his wife. He couldn't believe it. It made him incredibly angry. He's a man who is quick to anger anyway. Well, he didn't win that election, but he did win the one in 1828, which should be one of those living well is best revenge kind of deals. But in the meantime, between the first one that he lost, where they dragged her reputation through the mud, and the second one that he won, his wife died. So he outlived his wife. And yet, even though she's dead, When he ran in 1828, this time successfully, his opponent still dragged his wife's reputation through the mud, and she's not even alive anymore to defend herself, which made him incredibly angry. And those memories are very raw. He really hadn't been able to do much to help his wife through the humiliation that came from these political opponents of his calling Rachel Jackson all kinds of bad names. Well, now it's not that much longer later, and those wounds are still fresh in his psyche, and now a woman is being treated in sort of a similar way. A woman's reputation is being attacked unfairly by snobs, by people who, are making all casting aspersions and making all kinds of accusations that to him are clearly unfounded. He couldn't do anything to help his wife Rachel. He certainly couldn't do anything to help her with the second time he ran because she's dead. But now he can do something to help Peggy Eaton. And therefore, after it's clear that the cabinet members, his subordinates, the people who work for him, that they're not going to invite the Eatons to any of their parties because when you get down to it, their wives are more scared of Fluoride Calhoun than they are of President Jackson. Jackson called a meeting of his cabinet. He called them all together and he said, listen, if you guys don't invite the Eatons to your events, then I don't want to have anything to do with you. Okay, fair enough. It turns out that the wives refused to invite the Edens to their events, and so Jackson didn't have anything to do with the cabinet for 2 years. For 2 years, the first 2 years of his presidency, he refused to meet with his own cabinet, the people he had selected to run the country. He drew a line in the sand. They didn't budge in any way, and therefore he stuck to his guns. And more power to him for sticking to his guns, taking a moral stance, for supporting a woman who was being unfairly ostracized. Great, absolutely. I am impressed by that. I'm also bewildered by it because doesn't he have to run the country? For 2 years, he refused to meet with the actual people who are running the country on his behalf because of this scandal that's going on behind the scenes in Washington, D.C. about the cabinet wives and how they won't have anything to do with Peggy Eaton. Eventually, of course, the story broke because that's the sort of story that the newspapers are eventually going to find out about. And in the newspapers, it became referred to as the Peggy Eaton scandal or the petticoat affair. Petticoats are one of many pieces of clothing that women in the 19th century were supposed to wear. Thank goodness women of the 21st century don't have to wear such complicated clothing because they're ridiculous. But the implication of the nickname of the scandal is that Jackson's administration is really being reoriented and kind of pushed around by the women. And that this is the women, the cabinet wives, kind of forcing this agenda, and Jackson then rising to the bait and sort of overreacting. Opponents of Jackson are going to make fun of him for this. That you refuse to meet with your actual cabinet members because of stuff that the women are arguing about. All right. Well, Jackson does need to run the country, and so although he refuses to meet with his actual cabinet for 2 years, he did need somebody's advice, and he did need some political help, and so forth. And so, after it became clear that his real cabinet was never going to budge, he instead began to meet on a fairly regular basis with a bunch of unofficial advisors, local politicians, newspaper editors, people who had some political knowledge that he could draw on, who understood the situation in the country, whose advice he trusted. They're not official advisors. They're not secretary of this or ambassador of that or whatever. None of them had been officially approved or appointed or anything like that. They're just unofficial advisors. They don't meet in the cabinet room, which is a real place in the White House where the cabinet members meet. They don't meet there. Instead, they met in the kitchen, and so they got the nickname the kitchen cabinet because they're sort of an unofficial kind of sub rosa group of advisors that Jackson can lean on to get advice as he's trying to run the country without the real guys that he's actually picked. And when it turned out, when people, especially when Congress found out that Jackson was running the country based on advice from people who hadn't actually been appointed anything, there was a bit of a scandal about that as well, because you recall part of the checks and balances is that the Senate is supposed to approve the president's advisors. The Senate approves Secretary of State and the Senate approves Secretary of War, but the Senate didn't approve these guys that Jackson's just hanging around with, who are actually helping him run the country. And that seemed to some of the senators to be not the way that it's supposed to work. These days, we sort of accept presidents will get advice from anybody. They'll get advice from the official advisors who the president has appointed, as well as people that they may pick up the phone and call, or whomever. Our current administration, they get their advice from Fox News. It's wherever they get it from. So the kitchen cabinet helped Jackson make decisions and run the country for a couple of years, while the real cabinet basically cashed their paychecks, and I don't even know what they're doing because Jackson won't even talk to them. And finally, after a couple of years, it was clearly ridiculous that they weren't doing anything. So finally, after a couple of years, they came up with a solution to break this particular logjam of stubbornness on all sides. The only member of the cabinet that Jackson is still speaking to is his Secretary of State, a guy named Martin Van Buren, who's from upstate New York. Van Buren had not ticked off Jackson because Van Buren hadn't snubbed the Eatons. And the reason why he hadn't snubbed the Eatons was that he's not married. Like Jackson, he doesn't have a wife. And so that meant that he didn't throw any parties. And since he didn't throw any parties, then he didn't snub the Eatons on the guest list. And so eventually, Van Buren is somebody who Jackson is still communicating with. And Van Buren said, this is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Why do we even have a cabinet? You can't fire people because that would look like you're picking sides. So why don't I talk to all the rest of the cabinet guys who are also, they're all pretty clear on the fact this is dumb. And why don't we just all resign? And if we all quit all at once, then you can just start over. And that way the Eatons will be gone, but also all these other cabinet members will be gone, and you can start fresh, and you haven't picked a side, and you can sort of move on from here. Now, you can't get rid of the vice president because that guy's elected, and it's not like Calhoun's going to go anywhere just because his wife made people mad. But at least you can start fresh with the cabinet, and that's what wound up happening. It took 2 years, but Van Buren's idea was pretty successful. The cabinet resigned en masse, and then Jackson gets to appoint a whole new bunch of advisors and start fresh. He's lost a lot of momentum, though. The first 2 years of his administration really kind of spinning his wheels. He's not doing anything, but he is not as effective as a president as he wished to be because of this Peg Eaton scandal and the fact that his cabinet members are just, they're persona non grata to him as much as anybody could possibly be. Jackson does have things that he wants to do, and also Jackson has things that he wants to undo. He really wants to return the government to what he believed were the Jeffersonian principles of a limited government. He is a states' rights kind of a guy, the way Jefferson was, and he believes that the government had gotten too big and was doing too many things that it shouldn't do during the era of good feelings. And so he's looking for opportunities to kind of bring the government back to what he thought were the right kind of limitations. An example of that, during the period where the kitchen cabinet is advising him, there's a big political issue related to ongoing construction of the national road. Part of, and sort of one of the key ideas of the internal improvements part of the American system was the idea that the government should help pay for a road, literally just a road, that would go from the eastern seaboard all the way to eventually to the Mississippi River, and thus connect the West and the East together. Transportation is just so haphazard in those days that having a road that people knew where it was and that was effective and reliable and you could transport goods and people and so forth on that, that was going to be something that was going to be worthwhile. And so the government is getting involved in this during the era of good feelings. Prior to Jackson's administration, they had gotten the road all the way to Kentucky. Now in 1830, it's time to build the next part of the road. And so the bill that got passed through Congress to build the next part of the road is called the Maysville Road Bill, because it's going to connect the next part of the national road to a place in Kentucky called Maysville. It's going to go from one part of Kentucky to the other. but it's part of this long national road that the government is building in installments. That bill passed through Congress, but then it went to the president, and President Jackson in 1830 vetoed the Maysville Road bill because he said Congress isn't allowed to pay for something like this. The rules are the Constitution says that Congress has the right to get involved in interstate commerce, which means commerce or trade between states. Stuff within a state, that's the state's job. And Congress is not supposed to get involved in that. Well, this, as far as Jackson was concerned, was building a road from one part of one state to another part of the same state. And therefore, that's Kentucky's job to build that road, not the national government. And therefore, this shouldn't be something that the Congress should ever pass. So he vetoed the Maysville Road bill. Supporters of the road said, but this is just one part of a big, long road. And actually, if there's anything that's interstate commerce, building a road that connects all the different parts of the states together, that's it right there. But Jackson stuck to his guns and said, no. This is intrastate commerce. We're not supposed to be involved in this. Kentucky, you can pay for that yourselves. I'd like to point out that his arch enemy, Henry Clay, is from Kentucky. And also, Henry Clay's idea is the national road and the American system. So not only is Jackson standing up for states' rights and a limited federal government, but he's also giving a little bit of a zazz to Henry Clay and Henry Clay's allies, which I'm sure he enjoyed quite a lot. Jackson is going to wind up using the veto power a lot. Previous presidents were nervous about it. They'd only use it a handful of times and only on really minor things. Even though it's in the Constitution, it seemed to them like it was meddling in the responsibilities of Congress. Congress makes laws. For the president to disapprove a law of Congress, that seemed to them to be stepping across a line. But Jackson used the veto a lot. He used the veto more than his 6 predecessors combined and justified that by saying, it's in the Constitution. If the Constitution says I can veto laws, then I'm going to veto laws. And he's going to take a much more active role with regards to legislation than the previous presidents had ever thought to do. As I said, he's got a sense of a limited government. The government shouldn't do as much, but within those limitations, he, the president, should do a lot. Should be really the key focal point around which everything flows. So, not quite Thomas Jefferson in that way. Now, to get a better idea of Jackson's presidency and to get a better idea of his leadership style, we're going to dig into 2 major crises that took place during his presidency. And they both bleed from his first term into his second term. They're going to take a little while, but these are sort of long, complicated stories. And they're sort of test cases of how Andrew Jackson works as a politician and as a president and as a guy. Because already we've gotten the sense with the whole Peggy Eaton scandal that he is not like previous presidents. And really there haven't been a lot of presidents who would do what he did in the years following. I'm not sure if any of them ever would have, but Jackson did. So now let's test how things go when you have a bigger, more complicated crisis than just who gets invited to whose parties. So let's focus first on the bank. If you remember, the first national bank had been Alexander Hamilton's idea. He thought that there should be a national bank with branches all throughout the country, a private company run by private bankers. The government would be required to keep its money there. And because the government money is in the Bank of the United States, then other people would trust it. It would then wind up with enough money on hand that it could make loans all throughout the country, stimulate entrepreneurship the way banks are supposed to, and also its paper currency would be something that people could trust. So the first Bank of the United States, which the Democratic Republicans had hated, was created in 1791 and it expired in 1811. Then, once the era of good feelings started, and the Republicans, the only show in town at that point, when they went a little crazy, then they supported the same kind of idea, even though they had opposed it just a few years earlier. And so in 1816, Republicans, including Henry Clay, had pushed for the second Bank of the United States, with a charter very similar to the first one, Again, it's only going to last 20 years. Starts in 1816, it's going to expire in 1836. And it does the same things the previous bank had done. It's got branches all over the country. It's a private company run by bankers. The government puts its money there. Because the government money is there, then everybody else knows it's a bank they can trust. And then its loans will help stimulate the economy. And its banknotes will be something close to currency that people could trust all over the country. That's the idea. Now, the guy who ran the Bank of the United States is a Philadelphia banker named Nicholas Biddle. And Biddle was a typical banker, pretty conservative guy, tried to make sure that he didn't make any rash decisions and so forth. Not a politician by any stretch of the imagination. Believed very strongly in the bank. Was 100% convinced that the Bank of the United States was the most important economic institution in the country. And therefore, Nicholas Biddle was scared to death when Andrew Jackson was elected president. Because Jackson had made very clear that he hated banks, he didn't trust paper currency, and he hates, despises, fears, detests, you name your verb. He just doesn't like the Bank of the United States. And so Nicholas Biddle is pretty scared of Andrew Jackson. He's not just scared of what Jackson can do to the bank, because the bank is a private company, and a lot of its day-to-day workings even a president can't interfere with. But Biddle is looking ahead to the possibility of the bank just expiring, because the bank was chartered in 1816 for a 20-year period, and do the math, that means 1836 is when it's going to go out of business, unless Congress decided to give it more time. But that would require a law, and any law that Congress passes, the president would have to agree to, and we just heard Jackson is not shy with the veto. So, as far as Biddle is concerned, he can't let Jackson be president all the way to 1836. He's got to do something to stop Jackson from being reelected. Jackson got elected in 1828. If Jackson's reelected in 1832, then he'll be president all the way through 1836, and he will be able to block the bank from existing beyond its initial charter. And so, for a purely existential reason, Biddle has a problem with Andrew Jackson. Biddle is desperate to make sure that Jackson did not get reelected in 1832. The problem is that people like Andrew Jackson, and Biddle really can't figure out how he, a banker, can make that happen. But Biddle had an important ally, a guy on his side, one of the most important people in Washington, D.C., and a guy who doesn't like Andrew Jackson and would like to run against him, Henry Clay. Henry Clay had already had some unfortunate run-ins with Andrew Jackson. Clay is hoping that he can position himself as the anti-Jackson in 1832 and swoop into the White House. He feels the only way he can do that, though, is if he can find an issue on which it is clear that Jackson is wrong. He needs to figure out a way to get Jackson to make a mistake. Because Jackson was personally popular. A lot of people liked the guy. A lot of people were just impressed by, or amused by, or entertained by, or just sort of amazed by Jackson's ideas and the way he presents himself and how different he is. So, if Henry Clay is going to beat a man of the people like Andrew Jackson, then he has to show the people that this Andrew Jackson guy is just not for them. And therefore, Clay and Biddle, they've got something in common. They both don't want Andrew Jackson to be reelected. They both like the National Bank. And that turns out to be the issue that Clay thinks that he's got some room to work on. Because Clay has an incredible amount of influence over Congress. And Clay can therefore get Congress to do something that it didn't need to do, and then tick off Andrew Jackson. What Clay and Biddle decided to do was to try to get Congress to recharter the bank early. The bank is not due to expire until 1836. 1832, 4 years early, Biddle and Clay tried to get Congress to recharter the bank, to pass a law that would give it more time. If that fails, the bank will still exist because it already is supposed to last till 1836. It doesn't need to happen now, and so it's really very artificial. But the fact that it looks kind of fake and unnecessary is part of the beauty of this plan, because they know that if they can get it through Congress, It'll go to the president, and Jackson will just blow up because he will realize that there's no reason for this to exist. He hates banks, he hates Clay, he hates Biddle. They assume that he'll just blow up. They know his temperament. They know that Jackson is a guy who, just barely restrained anger at any given time. And they assume that if this legislation comes to him, that he is just going to explode. And the assumption is that he'll act so unpresidential and look like such a jerk that then Clay can tell the people, look what that guy did. That guy's not a president. So vote for me because I'm more presidential material and I'm, somebody who can help keep the country together with the institutions, the rock hard institutions that we need and trust. That's the plan. And the plan worked pretty well at first. Even though they don't need to recharter the bank yet, Clay was able to persuade enough people in Congress to pass legislation in 1832 that will recharter the bank then. And then that legislation went to Andrew Jackson, and he did get mad. So far, so good. Except that he didn't blow up. He got mad, but then he got out his pen. I think what they're assuming is that he is just going to get the legislation and he's going to tear it up, or that he's going to throw up on it, or that he's just going to get his crayons out and say this bites or something, and then send that back to Congress. But instead, Jackson saw this legislation, this proposed rechartering of the national bank, and it made him angry. He's going to veto it. Everybody knows he's going to veto it. But he explained himself. And presidents don't always do that. Sometimes they veto things and they just veto it. Sometimes they explain themselves. Sometimes they have a weird explanation. But in this case, Jackson sat down and decided to explain to Congress and really to the country why he was vetoing this recharter of the bank. He talks about how unnecessary it is, how the bank's not going anywhere for a while, no matter what happens in this legislation. But he digs deeper into what bothers him about the bank. Jackson says, listen, Thomas Jefferson thought the bank was unconstitutional. I think it's unconstitutional. Thomas Jefferson thought the bank was too strong and therefore corrupt, and I think the bank is too strong and therefore corrupt. As far as he was concerned, Jackson makes very clear in this message that the bank is just too big and therefore too dangerous. No one institution should have that much authority over the economy. It's just too dangerous for the people to exist like that. And because Jackson is clear that he thinks this is unconstitutional for the same reasons that Jefferson is, he's going to veto it. But in the message, Jackson says to Congress, listen, why waste my time with this? In fact, why waste my time with any piece of legislation that you know I'm going to veto? The smarter thing to do would be, during the process of making legislation, negotiate with the president, negotiate with the executive branch. Don't waste my time. Don't waste anybody's time passing legislation that's not going to go anywhere. Find out first whether it's got a chance. What he's calling for is, since the veto power exists, and therefore since the president does have a role to play in legislation, that the president and the legislative branch should negotiate over legislation. The president has a constitutionally mandated role in the passage of laws, and therefore those two branches should work together in whatever legislation gets passed by Congress, which doesn't sound like the rash, crazy ravings of a lunatic, which is what Henry Clay had been asking for. The bank veto message, as it's called, does go back to Congress, and that's the end of the recharter, and the bank isn't really going anywhere, and they have made Jackson angry, but they haven't made him look like a jerk because he took a moment to explain something that really today we take for granted in the relationship between Congress and the president. Whether Congress and the president have the same political ideas or are from the same political party or not, still they have to discuss with each other what's going on legislatively. The president may have an agenda that they're going to try to push through Congress. Congress may have things that they want to get past the president, but ultimately they have to work together if laws are going to get passed, and therefore there's a process that's ongoing to get legislation passed where they negotiate, these two different branches of the government. Jackson was saying that's what the Constitution is asking for, and so we're going to have to do that if we're going to get anywhere. And that sounds pretty rational. That sounds like a guy who knows what he's talking about. It doesn't sound like someone who, like Clay had hoped, doesn't sound like someone who's just a brat. The bank veto message helps make Jackson look more statesmanlike, um, and Henry Clay at that point really doesn't have much of an issue to run on. Clay did run against Jackson later that year, and he is hoping that Jackson will do some other dumb thing, or maybe that just the bank veto itself as a concept will be enough for him to persuade people that Jackson doesn't know what he's talking about, that he's not safe economically, or something like that. But he really doesn't have much of a chance because a lot of people really like Andrew Jackson. He's a very, very popular person, just one of those presidents who really has his finger on the pulse of the nation. And so as you get closer and closer to election day, it's pretty much a done deal. Just about everybody knows that Jackson is going to win re-election and that Clay once again is going to lose, at which point Nicholas Biddle completely panicked. He had tried this political maneuver with Henry Clay, and that hadn't gotten anywhere. It hadn't made Jackson look worse, it actually made him look better. And Biddle was freaked out about what was going to happen if Jackson got reelected, and so he decided to do everything he possibly could to not get Jackson reelected. He's the president of the Bank of the United States, a pretty important guy. So, in the waning weeks before the election, Nicholas Biddle called in all of the bank's loans, which they can do. If a bank loans you money, there's usually a rider somewhere in the agreement that says for extraordinary circumstances, the bank can basically say, we need all our money back. And that's a bad day for you if suddenly the bank says, we need our loan back, because you're probably not ready for that. And you're going to be in a bad position if suddenly you have to come up with that kind of cash. But when Nicholas Biddle called in all the bank's loans, what he's trying to do is show the American people how much they needed the bank. Because all the money that the Bank of the United States had circulated out through the economy and all the loans they had made to stimulate the business and entrepreneurship of the country, if that all has to come back, then that's going to show the American people, he thought, you guys need the Bank of the United States. But what he really did was he basically shut down the economy because he's scared of the president. And when he called in all the loans, it proved Jackson's point, which was that the Bank of the United States was this big behemoth, that it was this incredibly powerful economic entity that basically, because one man wanted to, basically shut down the economy for a few weeks because he's scared of the president. It doesn't require, you don't have to be a political genius to realize that this was kind of a dumb idea, and that Biddle had proven Jackson's point. It really wasn't going to go anywhere anyway, because it's not like it's going to change a lot of minds. It's just going to make more people hate and fear him and the Bank of the United States, which works for Jackson. Jackson therefore got reelected. He got reelected pretty easily. And he took office for the second time, sworn in early 1833. His second inauguration, not nearly as exciting as the first one. And then, after he was safely sworn in, then he decided to get his revenge. He had held his temper for a really long time, but the way Clay and Biddle had tried to manipulate him into getting angry had made him furious. He just sort of held his temper for a while. The way Biddle had tried to manipulate the economy as a way to get him not reelected made him furious. He was convinced that there was no way that the Bank of the United States should keep existing all the way to 1836, even though that was how long their original charter was supposed to allow them, because Biddle would continue to harass the economy, shut things down that needed to happen. He couldn't let the bank keep existing. So, early in his second term, Jackson called in his Secretary of the Treasury, the most important economic guy in his cabinet, and he said, I need you to pull all the government money out of the Bank of the United States. And the Secretary of the Treasury said, well, Your Honor, Your Excellency, Your Jacksonship, whatever, I'd like to do that. I don't like the bank. But legally, we are required to have the government money in the Bank of the United States. The law that created it requires us to put it there. And President Jackson listened carefully and said, okay, got it. Thank you for your advice. You're fired. legally the guy was right, but that's not the advice Jackson wanted to hear. He fired his Secretary of the Treasury and then set about to find a new Secretary of the Treasury. So early in his second term, he replaced his original Secretary of the Treasury. He's now in like his third. Um, Replaced him with one of the veterans of the kitchen cabinet, a Maryland politician from the Eastern Shore, a guy named Roger Taney. And it's spelled Taney, but it's pronounced Taney. Roger Taney, who is a close political ally of Andrew Jackson, is going to listen to what the president has to say, no matter what the president says. Roger Taney got sworn in as the new Secretary of the Treasury after all the process of the hearings and the stuff of the Senate, and he got voted on and so forth. And so then, after he got installed as the new Secretary of the Treasury, President Jackson called him in and said, I want you to pull all the money out of the Bank of the United States. And Secretary of the Treasury Roger Taney said, yeah, sure, absolutely. I'll take care of that, tomorrow, next week, when do you want it to happen? Um, the first guy was right. That's illegal. The law that created the Bank of the United States requires the federal government to put its money in the Bank of the United States. But Jackson and Taney working together pulled all the money out of the Bank of the United States, breaking the law because they wanted to destroy the Bank of the United States. And indeed, they basically crippled the bank, which struggled to continue to exist, and it made it all the way to 1836. And in fact, sort of survived even a little bit after that, but was a shadow of its former self. Nicholas Biddle has much less ability to influence the economy, and basically fades away as a major problem for Andrew Jackson to worry about. So Jackson had succeeded, although the way he did that was basically, forget basically, completely. He broke the law, and eventually the leaders of Congress pointed this out, and they considered briefly the possibility of impeachment. In the end, they censured him, which is essentially the kind of a slap on the wrist, where there's an official censure, an official statement saying that these two guys, the president and the secretary of the treasury, had broken the law. And that, even though it was anything close to impeachment, it was still pretty embarrassing for the president. But he got what he wanted on the bank, and probably that was good enough. Now, after they pulled the money out, and that happened in 1833, then there's another sort of follow-up question, which is, well, what do we do with all the money? Because the government does have money. It earns money from taxes and tariffs and the sale of Western lands and various other things. So what's the federal government going to do with its money when it generates revenue in between then and when they have to pay money out? Where is that money going to sit? I mean, they could bury it in the rose garden, but that's not a very good idea. So it should be in a bank somewhere. That would make sense. They're not going to put it in the Bank of the United States anymore. So what Jackson and Taney decided to do in 1833 was to take the government money out of the Bank of the United States, but then distribute it to a bunch of small local banks who were run by people that they trusted. And so all these bankers all over the country suddenly find out that they're going to be a place that the government's going to deposit some of its money, which was a very pleasant surprise to those bankers, most of whom were small local bankers who were politically allied with Jackson, supporters of Jackson, people that Taney knew that they could trust, suddenly find out that they're going to get government money in their banks. And not only once, but they're going to be regularly getting these infusions of cash. These bankers suddenly they're on the moon because they have all this cash they don't know what to do with. Jackson and Biddle thought this would be a good way to sort of stimulate the economy by spreading the money out and putting it in the hands of bankers in different parts of the country. They thought that this would make sure the government money got used in a way that would sort of stir the economy because they would make loans to local businesses. And in fact, a lot of these little banks did do that. Biddle had been kind of a conservative banker and had been less likely to make big loans or loans with not much collateral, and he wasn't a risky guy. He doesn't want to risk the government's money. These other bankers, they're playing with house money. They suddenly have a lot of cash. They're going to use that cash and made a lot of loans and helped stimulate the economy, which was good for a while, but just for a while. Now, opponents of Jackson, and there are plenty of them, plenty of people who are watching what Jackson is doing all through his administration and are saying he's acting like a dictator, he's acting like a king, he's acting irrationally, not just Henry Clay, not just people who want to be president, There are plenty of people who oppose Jackson or have problems with him. Opponents of Jackson said that these little banks, the little local banks, you're really rewarding your political allies. This is just like the rotation in office really is the spoil system. Destroying the Bank of the United States and putting it in local banks is, again, it's just another way to help out people who are friends of yours. And the little local banks that the government put its money in got the nickname the pet banks, on the idea that the bankers who ran them were just sort of like the little toys, the little show dogs of the president and Secretary of Treasury Roger Taney. The pet banks, as they were known, as I said, they made more loans, they spent more money, they got that money out there, they helped stimulate the economy. In the short term, this actually was probably good for the U.S. that the pet banks had the government money because suddenly they can make all these extra loans and help expand the economy. In the not so short term, this is going to backfire. But that's not a problem for Andrew Jackson to worry about. As it turns out, the pet banks eventually are going to implode, but he's not president anymore at that point. So he and Roger Taney had broken the law, and that's not very good. On the other hand, he had handled Biddle and Clay very adroitly, had helped position himself in the whole legislative process in a way that sounds very statesmanlike. And if this is a test of his abilities as a leader, on the one hand, he comes through with flying colors. On the other hand, he breaks the law and punishes one of his archenemies by breaking the law. Mixed, I would say. Mixed. Another crisis that happened sort of in parallel to this is about the tariff. And you notice the bank and the tariff were both issues that started with Hamilton, and they continued well into the time long after Hamilton was not anywhere around. So the tariff, you'll remember, was the idea that there would be a tax on imports that would be high enough that would help protect American businesses, because the cheap stuff is being made in England. Americans want to buy cheap, but if there's a tax on imports, that will make the price go up and then make it more likely for American consumers to buy American-made goods. The first tariff had been passed in 1791. It wasn't as high as Alexander Hamilton wanted, and then the story of the tariff is sort of a story of up and down and up and down. During the era of good feelings, the Republicans, who used to hate the high tariff, then went a little bit loopy and decided they liked a high tariff, partly because the War of 1812 had taught them the lesson that they needed to be able to defend themselves economically against the British. So, the Republicans then began to raise the tariff during the era of good feelings, and it had gone up and up and up. Every few years, there's a new discussion of the tariff, and every few years, the Republicans, led by Henry Clay, had pushed tariff rates up. And eventually, that became sort of locally and regionally divisive. People in New England, and more generally the northern states, supported a high tariff because there was more manufacturing there. The early days of factories and manufacturing largely is New England, New York, New Jersey, Philadelphia. That's where most of that early manufacturing is, which is where there's going to be support for high tariffs because they want to make sure that they get protected from Americans wanting to buy cheap imports. But as a result, conversely, the southern states didn't like a high tariff because they don't have manufacturing there. There aren't businesses there. There aren't really industries that are being built there. And so it's not going to help them locally. Instead, the southern states, they have plantations. They grow stuff. And what they were worried about was not only the tariffs going to help the other part of the country and not help them. They were worried that it was going to artificially inflate the prices of everything, the way I mentioned previously, and therefore hurt them. And they're also worried that the British were going to retaliate because if the Americans have a high tariff against British goods, then the British response would be to have a high tariff against American-made products, including the most important thing that the plantations of the South are producing, which is, by this point, is cotton. The cotton plantation owners in the Deep South, they're scared to death that there'll be a tariff war, and they won't be able to sell their cotton at a high profit to the British anymore. So Southerners eventually, as the era of good feelings continued, Southerners began to feel that the tariff was boxing them in. And important political leaders in the South felt that the tariff was hurting their region and they needed to try to do something about it to stop the increasing up momentum of the tariff. So, late in John Quincy Adams' presidency, before Andrew Jackson was president, there was an opportunity when it was time for Congress to discuss the tariff again. They do this every few years. They try to figure out, should it go up on this? Should it go down on that? Overall, what do we want to do with it? Because it's something that circumstances change, and so they need to reconsider the tariff periodically. So it's time in 1828 for them to do that again. And a bunch of Southerners on the key committee in Congress decided that they were going to try to prove their point and make sure that the tariff could sort of turn around and get lower. And so their strategy was that they proposed the highest tariff in American history, higher than anyone had ever suggested before. The theory behind this was if they propose a tariff so high that it was ridiculous, then that would get voted on. And of course, it would be not voted on. Of course, Congress wouldn't approve that. And then they would be able to then say, oh, you don't like a high tariff. Oh, okay. And then they would propose a lower tariff. And it'd be hard for people to vote against that when they had just voted against raising the tariff. They're trying to figure out a way legislatively to get Congress to vote for turning the tariff in the other direction. And so this is their theory. Propose an incredibly sky-high tariff, higher than anybody's ever seen before. And then after that gets voted down, then counter-propose a low tariff. The problem is that when these Southern representatives suggested the highest tariff in American history, it actually passed. Oops. Oops. Yeah, they did this to themselves. And afterwards, they regretted it. But they didn't blame anybody else. In fact, they blamed everybody else. They don't blame themselves. Southerners refer to this tariff, the highest tariff ever that had ever existed prior to this time, higher than anyone had ever even suggested before. They call it the tariff of abominations to emphasize just how much they hate it. And Southerners are not just upset with the tariff in 1828 because they know it's going to come down. I mean, it's so crazily high. There's no way it can stay up at these incredibly high percentage rates. But what worries them is that, yeah, a few years from now, Congress will vote on the tariff again and they'll lower it. But they're not going to lower it to where we want. We want a tariff that's lower than what it had been originally. The tariff of abominations is so much higher that 3 or 4 years from now, they'll lower it a little bit. And then maybe 3 or 4 years from now, they'll lower it a little bit more. And even if we can keep getting it lower and lower and lower every cycle, it might take 20 years to get the tariff down to the level that the South thought was the safe, low level of the tariff. In the meantime, they thought that their entire economy was going to be devastated and that their whole region was going to just be a wreck. So the tariff of abominations, which really was the result and the poor result of miscalculation on the part of Southern people in Congress, then forced Southerners to try to come up with a new strategy. And the key guy here, and he is really the sort of the second of Jackson's great villains, the key guy here is John C. Calhoun. Calhoun, who I've mentioned already in the context of the Peggy Eaton story, because he and his wife Fluoride are key to that story, Calhoun had been one of the war hawks and one of this sort of second generation of American leaders that came on the scene around the time of the War of 1812, became a big national figure, and that led him to become vice president. But it's worth pointing out, he wasn't just Jackson's vice president. He had actually served as vice president under John Quincy Adams in the previous administration. So he had been John Quincy Adams' vice president after the 1824 election. Then, as they got closer to the 1828 election, John C. Calhoun realized that John Quincy Adams was going to lose, and so he reached out to Andrew Jackson and said, how about I be your running mate in 1828, and basically he jumped ships. So he wound up being vice president for 2 consecutive terms with 2 different presidents, which I don't know. Calhoun believes that he should be president someday. And given his understanding of the way politics worked, before the era of good feelings fell apart, and before whatever the new politics after the era of good feelings is going to turn out to be, he thought that politics was pretty local, and therefore he needed to sew up as much support as he could in the Deep South. And so, as the Tariff of Abominations got passed, and as anti tariff sentiment expanded throughout the southern states, Calhoun realized that this was the issue that he needed to get in on if he's ever going to make sure that all the Southerners, all the Southern politicians support him. The problem is he's vice president, which is not really an important job. There's nothing you really do as vice president unless the president tells you to do it first. Officially, your only job is to break ties when the Senate has a tie vote. That's basically your job, and that happens, maybe never in your term in office. So there's not much that Calhoun can do, as everyone in the South is all upset about the tariff, and especially the Tariff of Abominations in 1828. Except that he's smart and he can write and he's got ideas, and for him, the way the South was upset about the tariff reminded him of a generation earlier when there were people who were upset over the Alien and Sedition Acts. And to him, the tariff was similar to the Alien and Sedition Acts in that it was a federal government law that seemed inherently unfair and seemed to be taking away the rights of the people. Now, I'm not sure that raising the tariff is really quite the same thing as taking away a right to protest. But anyway, that's how he interpreted it. And so he saw himself as having a similar role as Thomas Jefferson and James Madison had during the period in the late 1790s when they were protesting the Alien Sedition Acts. So he did a similar thing. Jefferson and Madison had gotten in touch with their state legislatures who were friends with them, and had gotten the Virginia and Kentucky legislatures to pass resolutions opposing the law that they didn't like, which was the Alien Sedition Acts back then, but explaining that there was a constitutional justification for states to fight against bad federal laws. So Calhoun revived that and did a similar thing. He drafted a document for South Carolina state legislature. It's called the South Carolina Exposition and Protest. It's similar to the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions because it's officially something that the state legislature of South Carolina says. What they know is that it actually really was secretly drafted by Vice President Calhoun, who is from South Carolina and knows all these guys. And the language is very similar to the old Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, although it goes a little bit further. Back then, Jefferson and Madison had talked about how states, because they created the Constitution since they had to ratify it, should have the right to stop bad laws. And the key word there was to nullify laws. In the South Carolina Exposition and Protest, Calhoun takes that a step further and gets very clear in the language that if there are laws that a state just simply cannot allow, if a federal government passes a law that the people in a particular state just cannot allow because they believe it's wrong or bad for them or unconstitutional, then they should have the right to stop that law from existing in their state. And so what he's calling for is what's called nullification, the right of a state to get rid of, to just completely get rid of any federal law that they won't allow in their state. Now, if nullification really is a thing, I'll point out it effectively undermines the whole idea of the Constitution, where states have certain rights, but they don't have the rights to just get rid of laws passed by the federal government. If they do, then we just go back to the Articles of Confederation. But Calhoun is more worried about a federal law that makes people in the South really unhappy, which is the tariff, and that's the idea of nullification here. In theory, if he's right, and if South Carolina wants to try it, then they can say this tariff cannot exist in our state. And that's the threat, that's the theory. It's purely a theoretical exercise. It mostly is written as a way for Southerners to kind of spread the idea that they're going to fight back against what they thought was a terrible thing, the tariff, but also as a way to express a states' rights point of view against what they thought was a too strong federal government role overall in the national economy. And anytime states' rights gets involved, uh, one of the issues there is also a fear that maybe someday the federal government might come after slavery. But the tariff is the real issue here. That's the issue on the table. Now, at first, this is just a South Carolina thing. The South Carolina legislature passed the document, and everyone in South Carolina knows it was really written by Vice President Calhoun. And at first, it's just sort of a local simmering thing. People in the Deep South, people in the places where plantations are most important, they're kicking around this idea of nullification. They're angry about the tariff. They're trying to figure out some way to fight back against it. And the ideas that Calhoun had put forth, borrowing from ideas from Jefferson and Madison, those seem to them intellectually interesting and worth discussing, potentially as a way that they can fight back or at least stand up for themselves against what they thought was a really bad federal law. But at first, this is just talk. It's just an idea. It's not something they're going to do. And, who knows? Maybe they're never going to do it. If they can persuade the government to change its policies, maybe they don't have to worry about whether there really is such a thing as nullification. But it's something they're talking about, particularly in South Carolina and some of the other deep South states. They're talking about this idea of nullification. It's not a national issue. It's not something that people all over the country are talking about at first. It's a purely Southern idea. But it became a national issue and came to the national forefront during Jackson's presidency. So the South Carolina Exhibition of Protest, the Tariff of Abominations, those were both in 1828. That was while John Quincy Adams was still president. Then Jackson got inaugurated, and Jackson is a Southerner. He's a slave owner. He's a plantation owner. He's a Jefferson fan. He believes in a limited federal government. He believes in states' rights. Everyone kind of assumes they know where he's going with this, but the tariff is not an issue at first in his presidency because the law already exists. And the Southerners are just sort of talking about this, and it's not something that's on his radar at first. It's not really on anybody's national radar at first until about partway through Jackson's first term when there's a big debate in Congress that suddenly splashed this on the front pages. This is going to be called the Hayne-Webster debate of 1830. All right, so the two key players here are a senator from South Carolina named Robert Hayne and a senator from Massachusetts named Daniel Webster, who I introduced previously as one of the war hawks who had helped lead the country toward the War of 1812. He is now probably the most prominent politician from New England and a strong defender of the rights of New England. So what happened here is that Congress is debating a proposed piece of legislation, the idea of which would be to stop selling as much of the land out in the Western Territories to investors. And there's any number of reasons why you might support that, conservation reasons, or we want to hold on to the land and get money for it later, or whatever. But Southerners were very worried about it because selling land was one of the ways that the government made money. And if the government stops selling so much land, then they're going to have to find money somewhere else, which means that they're going to have to keep the tariff high. And Southerners are very worried about the tariff, and so anything that's in any way connected to the tariff immediately has them sort of their eyes lit up, and they're trying to fight it. So even though it's a fairly obscure piece of legislation that doesn't seem like it's a big deal at all, the Southerners went after it in a big way as a way to begin to also go after the tariff. So Robert Hayne, the big spokesperson for the Southern point of view, stood up on the floor of the Senate and he attacked this legislation. And he said what's going on here is that New England, just like they did during the Hartford Convention, they're trying to stop the expansion of the country. They're trying to do things just for them. And the people who are going to suffer if this law gets passed are the Westerners who aren't going to be able to get land to expand into, and the Southerners who are going to be forced to keep this high tariff, hurting their economy. And the only people who are going to benefit are the New Englanders, the people in the places where there's manufacturing and who would like the country to sort of not keep expanding. So he makes that point, and he's eloquent, and all of his supporters clap politely, and they hoot and holler. And he sits down, and he feels like he's done a pretty good job. But then the big spokesperson for New England gets up to rebut. This is Daniel Webster, and Daniel Webster responds and says, "My honored, esteemed colleague from South Carolina doesn't really know how this country is divided. So we in New England, we are not enemies with the rest of the country. In fact, if there's any real division in this country, that division isn't New England against the South and the West. No, that division is the slave states and the non-slave states. Because the real reason why South Carolina and these other Southern politicians get worried about things like this legislation is they're worried they're falling behind. And the reason why they're worried about that is because they have slavery, and slavery is an antiquated institution. It's antiquated economically, and it is making the South fall behind the rest of the country. In fact, the part of the country that's pulling away from the South is the Northeast, which has factories, which are growing the economy, and then the Western farmers. And the thing they have in common is they're entrepreneurial, they're enterprising, and they're free. And the free laborers, the hardworking people of the New England factories or of the Western farms, they're working together to make the economy grow. The South is falling behind and getting nervous about it, and they're grasping at straws and they're looking for scapegoats, and that's why they're overreacting to this legislation. And so therefore we should pass it. And so he gets some applause and he sits down and and all his buddies in New England are like, yeah, great job, Daniel. And then Robert Hayne rises again because now he feels that his region of the country has been directly attacked by this scurrilous dude from New England. And so his response is, I think that I just heard my esteemed colleague from New England say that slavery is bad. I think that I heard my esteemed colleague from Massachusetts say that slavery is bad for the country, is bad for a bad way to run an economy, and he is wrong. Slavery is good for us. Slavery is good for this country. Slavery is something that our country was built on. And Robert Haynes says, "Don't you dare," more or less what he's saying, "don't you dare ever imply that slavery is bad. You can't come around here and mess with our system. We're going to fight for that if we need to defend ourselves. Instead, if you guys try to mess with us, if the federal government ever tries to mess with something as fundamental as slavery, we will stop you. And the way we'll stop you is the way we're going to stop this legislation or any other kind of bad legislation, like the tariff or anything, we will nullify it. Because we, states in the South, we have this right. We have the right to step in and block bad federal laws. And we won't let you do dumb things like the tariff. We won't let you stop selling Western lands. We definitely won't let you stop us from having slavery. So forget it. We have this right and we will use it. We will nullify the laws, the bad laws of the federal government." He sits down. And he feels pretty good about himself, and all the Southerners are cheering for him because he stood up for their part of the country and he stood up for their way of life and their institution of slavery, which of course is repugnant, but that's not what they think. And then Daniel Webster stands up and he gets the last word. And he says, "All right, let's put aside slavery. You guys want to have slavery? That's your business. Individual states can make your decision on that. I don't want to I don't want to harp on that particular issue. But I do want to focus on this constitutional issue that you just raised. You just said that states have the right to get rid of federal laws, and they don't. The only reason for that would be if nullification was a real thing, if states are really the center of the government, and that's not the case. He makes very clear that it is the people's government and it is of the people and by the people, language that Lincoln later used in the 1850s. And at the end, in his peroration, he says, um, let's see if we can get this right here, liberty and the Union now and forever, one and inseparable. And he sums it up that way by saying that the Constitution as written is going to work for the benefit of everybody, but only if they all work together, as opposed to the destructive ideas of nullification that Robert Hayne is proposing. That phrase, that liberty and union phrase, is on his tombstone. It's sort of his big moment. And this is an impressive debate given that they haven't prepped for this. This is all off the cuff. And they go hours and hours at a time, and people are cheering for them on both sides and so forth. And after it's all over, the legislation is basically forgotten because on the floor of the Senate, suddenly what's happened here is they're arguing over North versus South. They're arguing over slavery versus not slavery and which is better for the country. And they're arguing over nullification and whether or not a state can actually stop a law from happening. That idea of nullification, which was this little local idea, which was this South Carolina idea, little pet idea at first, has now burst onto the national scene. And now it's time for the whole country to think about what they want to do about it. Whether they want to accept the idea potentially, or whether they want to try to figure out a way to make it go away, or whatever. But now it's an issue. It's a real issue. And as it turns out, now it's time to find out what Jackson thinks about it because no one really asked him. They kind of assume they know, though. Like I said, he's a Southerner. He loves Thomas Jefferson. He's a states' rights guy. He's a slave owner. He hates the tariff. It's pretty clear to all the Southerners that he's on their side. But there wasn't really an obvious way to ask him or to get him to go on record. And so, as they're trying to get this nullification idea going, and as they're trying to get more support for it, they want the president's support so that they can maybe someday do something like block the tariff. But they need to get him on record. And there's ways you can do that today, there's press conferences or whatever. But in those days, the president didn't have as many official things where you could actually find out what the president thought about certain things unless he wanted to. Um, but they know he's going to be at a public event a little bit later in 1830 because Jefferson's birthday is a big celebration in Washington, D.C. every year. And so there's a big committee that puts together this banquet, and they have speeches, and there's a big dinner. And then afterwards, there are toasts that are made where people sort of off the cuff have remarks where they respond to whatever the topic or themes of the speeches were. Well, Jackson's going to be at the Jefferson dinner because Jefferson is his big hero. But as it turns out, the committee that's organizing the Jefferson dinner are mostly from the Deep South, people like a Robert Hayne and so forth. And so they realized that what they could do was they're going to have Jackson there, sort of a captive audience. And they could then have all the speeches be about nullification, have all the speeches be about states' rights and the tariff, and especially this idea that the states should be able to stop bad federal laws and take the Robert Hayne point of view in the Hayne-Webster debate on the assumption that after it's all over, that Jackson would then raise his glass and drink a toast to nullification or drink a toast to states' rights or in some way express his approval of what he had just heard. And then the whole country would know that the president was on their side because they assume he is. I mean, he's from the South. He's a slave owner. He's a states' rights guy. He loves Thomas Jefferson. So they have this Jefferson Day dinner, and Jackson is there, and they're eating their rubber chicken, and they're chatting with their neighbors at the tables and wherever they are, somewhere in D.C. And all the speeches are about nullification, and all the speeches are about the ideas of the South Carolina Exposition and Protest, and all the speeches are about states' rights, and all the speeches, and then after it's all over, then all eyes turn to Jackson. He's the most important guy in the room, and he raises a glass, and his response is he raises a glass and he drinks a toast to our federal union It must be preserved. He drinks his glass down and sits down. And there's a hush that falls over the room because although the context was about states' rights, he responded by drinking a toast to the Union, to the idea of the Constitution, to the idea of keeping the country together, to the very opposite of what the nullification idea was. It's sort of a shocking moment that none of the Southerners and none of the states' rights supporters and none of the nullifiers expected. They should have, though, because he is the President of the United States. He wasn't elected as the President of Tennessee. He wasn't elected as the President of just the South. He's the President of the whole United States. And Jackson recognized that nullification as an idea would undermine the very concept of the Constitution. So he believed in Jefferson's ideals of states' rights, but he did not go anywhere near as far as nullification. Well, that's a surprise to everyone in the room, including Vice President Calhoun, who has been sitting there listening to the speeches and quite enjoying them, and assuming that President Jackson is on his side. And now suddenly he's found out, with everyone else in the room, that Jackson's not on his side, and all eyes turn to him because, as the second most important guy in the room, he should make the next toast. But what's he going to do? Because if he makes a toast to nullification, then he's just gone against his boss. But if he makes a toast to the Union or to the things that Jackson just toasted to, then everyone else in the room is going to hate him or at least be surprised. So Calhoun's a little boxed in. His response, he stands up and his toast, and his hand is visibly shaking because this is a bad moment for him. His toast is the Union next to our liberties the most dear. So what he's saying is the Union is really, really important, just like my boss said. But our liberties, which he means states' rights, are more important. So Union good. Don't get me wrong, Union good. But states' rights, the ability of states to overthrow some federal laws, that's more important. And he drinks his toast to that. It's kind of a wishy-washy toast. The states' rights people in the room recognize the situation that he's in, and so they don't feel that bad for him. They're not that mad at him that he didn't more effusively be on their side. But it makes Jackson really mad because the vice president, who he has not really gotten along with for his entire presidency so far, including all the Peg Eaton stuff, has just basically had a chance to stand up for him and hasn't really done it. And suddenly, in that moment, Jackson puts it all together. Wait a minute. South Carolina, nullification, states' rights. You did this to me. It's like in The Godfather 2. I know it was you, Fredo. Um, so in this moment, Jackson and Calhoun, whose relationship had been very bad anyway, now completely soured. And from that moment on, Jackson and Calhoun are arch enemies. And Calhoun will eventually not wind up as the vice president in the second term. Jackson just lets him go and winds up with his buddy Martin Van Buren instead. Calhoun goes back to South Carolina and prepares to defend the idea of nullification against what it turns out to be a much angrier President Jackson than he guessed. So, as you get to 1832, which is the next time Congress is going to discuss the tariff, the South Carolinians are hoping for a lower tariff because they hate the high tariff, which is kind of their fault. Tariff of abominations in 1828 was super duper high. 1832, Congress decided that was too high, and they lowered the tariff rate. But as South Carolina and the rest of the Deep South feared, not that much. They brought it down a bit, which means that they're partly getting what they want, but it also means that they're not going to get what they really, really want, maybe for years and years. So they waited out for a legislative remedy. They gave Congress a chance to lower the tariff, and then Congress didn't come through for them. So in South Carolina, they decided they had no choice. This law is just, as far as they're concerned, just going to destroy them. And so in South Carolina, they got together this big convention of all the leading lights in the state, and they voted to nullify the tariff in their state. They give a deadline of early 1833, and at that moment, the tariff cannot exist in their state, which means basically that that law, and maybe every federal law, is just not going to exist in the state of South Carolina. Now, South Carolina knew that all the other southern states didn't like the tariff either, and they assumed that once they nullified the tariff in their state, that all the other states would follow suit. But it didn't happen. None of the other states in the South were ready to take on the federal government in such a direct way. Although they hate the tariff, they're not ready for the idea of nullification and all the implications that come with it. Because really, if all the southern states vote to nullify the tariff, then you could have the Civil War happening in 1833. You could have the South fighting against the tariff and fighting for an extreme states' rights position against the federal government, and you could have the federal government trying to impose the tariff by force. I mean, that could have been the Civil War right there, except in 1833, no one is willing to go as far as South Carolina goes. And so South Carolina is sort of on a limb all by themselves, and no one else comes out to join them on the limb, and they're in kind of a tough position. Make matters worse, Andrew Jackson, the president, is pretty mad at them. So, in 1832 and into 1833, Jackson negotiates with Congress and gets them to pass a bill called the Force Bill. The idea of this legislation is that it will allow the president himself personally to use the army to enforce the tariff. Specifically, the Force Bill says the president is duly authorized to use the army to enforce federal laws. And so the theory here is that after South Carolina says you can't have the tariff in our state anymore, that Andrew Jackson, who is a former military man and knows his way around a uniform, Andrew Jackson himself personally is going to march into South Carolina, arrest all the nullifiers, hang them for treason, force the tariff to be collected in South Carolina. That's what he's hoping to do. And it's not going to go that well for South Carolina, I can tell you, especially if the rest of the South is not going to come help them out, which they're not going to do. They're not ready for this kind of extreme states' rights position, and they're a little scared of Andrew Jackson. So, South Carolinians are getting closer and closer to a reckoning with destiny where they're going to have to find out whether they really mean it and whether they're willing to take the consequences, which could be pretty serious. As that drags closer and closer, in Congress, Henry Clay got nervous about the fact that there could be fighting over the tariff. And so even though Congress wasn't supposed to discuss the tariff again for a few years, they do it every 3 or 4 years. They just passed one a few months earlier. But Clay quickly got together a coalition to lower the tariff right away in 1833. And so he was able to get Congress to agree to a 20-year package that's going to lower the tariff and guarantee that it gets down to the level that South Carolina wanted it to get to. So they would know that they would get it to that low tariff percentage that they wanted. Not right away, so the North would still have some high tariff years at first, but eventually the South will get what they want, and the compromise tariff of 1833 quickly lowered a couple tariff rates to the level South Carolina wanted. So the North will keep a high tariff for a little while. The South will eventually get a low tariff a little bit farther down the line, but they both know what they're getting and they can plan accordingly. Clay's compromise tariff helps defuse the situation because the South knows that they're going to definitely be guaranteed the big tariff issue that they want, and thus, right before the deadline, the South Carolina nullifiers unnullified the tariff. They voted that they would allow the federal tariff to be collected in their state, and thus Jackson doesn't get to ride into South Carolina to arrest them and hang them or shoot them or whatever it is he's hoping to do because they've blinked and they're going to let the tariff happen. Now, in the last second before they go their separate ways, the guys in South Carolina nullified the Force Bill, which is basically sort of a screw you to Andrew Jackson because he's not going to be able to use the Force Bill anymore It's sort of their way of saying, yeah, we're really still in charge and we can do what we want. And if there's bad federal laws, we can get rid of them and then go their separate ways without having to worry about the consequences of that. Um, the crisis at that point was over, although not over forever. It's not the tariff that's eventually going to start the Civil War. It's going to be slavery, but we are beginning to see some signs that the North and the South see themselves very differently. And slavery was part of the story of the tariff too, as we saw in the Hayne-Webster debate, and it's never really very far from any discussion of this time, even if it takes a while to officially come to the top. Now, how does Jackson handle that particular crisis? Well, on the one hand, I'm impressed by his ability to think about the whole country and not just his states' rights principles. On the other hand, the fact that he's clearly looking for revenge and direct revenge. He wants to hang Hayne and Calhoun and the other nullifiers. He wants to personally do it. That's not really statesmanlike. That's not really the kind of presidential behavior you're looking for. Mixed, I'd guess. All right. One last thing about Jackson before we wrap up for the night. I said already, Jackson is one of the most popular guys at the time, and he could have kept running. He was very popular. He was very electable. He has the common touch. The people like him, and they like to vote for him. He is the common man incarnate, as they say. And great, whatever. He probably has the ability to speak to the people, the regular, ordinary people, in a way that very few American politicians ever have. I would say Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s and 40s, Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, have a similar ability to sort of just get people, regular, ordinary people, to be inspired by some of their ideas. Jackson has that ability. He can speak to the common man. But that really shouldn't matter because the country, when it was first laid out, although in theory citizenship and republicanism was really the deal, there were a lot of ways in which it didn't really matter what the common people thought, because in the old days, the early states, the early parts of the United States of America, there were a lot of laws on the books that limited the ability of ordinary people to influence politics. The way the model worked of voting in most of the early states was very limited. You had to own property, or you had to pay taxes up to a certain point before you could actually vote. And although, yes, compared to other parts of the world, more people can do that here than in other parts of the world, still, that's a limitation on the franchise, which meant that the ability to vote was somewhat limited, which meant that what the common people think wasn't part of the political equation really in the early days, although the rhetoric said that it was. But over time, that began to change. And what we call suffrage, which is the allowing of the ability of people to vote, that became expanded as the country itself expanded. So as new states opened up, as the country spread away from the original 13 states, which had a lot of limitations on voting, as you get to places like Kentucky and Tennessee and Ohio, and as you get farther and farther into the West, those new states, when they were created by mostly just regular, ordinary people, farmers and tradesmen and regular people who had gone out to those new states and sort of tried their best and eventually created these states with sort of a new point of view, that Jackson point of view, the regular, ordinary guy. Um, and they had no particular reason to have limits on voting. Just about everybody who moved out to those states were pretty much just ordinary folks. They'd gone there to get land. At first there aren't a lot of big land ownership and big rich people there, and so there's no real need or political urge to limit the number of voting based on property rights or taxing or things like that. And so the Western states had very few restrictions on voting. Basically, you have to be above a certain age and you have to be a white guy. So that's pretty restricted by our standards. But compared to the older states, the Western states had very few limitations on the suffrage. And then that idea that there should be fewer restrictions on the suffrage began to spread back to the East. So you have early Western test cases of lowering the restrictions on voting and allowing more people to get into voting. By the 1830s, those ideas had spread from the West, from the new states, back to the East, to the majority of the country in those older states, and more states began to let more people vote. By the 1850s, almost every state allows all white guys, at least, to vote. There's just a handful of holdouts by the time you get to the Civil War. But broadly speaking, the period of Jackson's era is also the period in which politics opened up and the common man had more say. And who is going to benefit from that other than someone like an Andrew Jackson who speaks to the common man, who has the same hatreds as some of the common men, but also some of the same enthusiasms and interests, and certainly the same kind of gusto as the common man. He is the guy who is the best recipient of the love and the votes of this political change. And so historians talk about something called Jacksonian democracy in the Jackson era, especially 1830s or so forth around there. That's when this became very obvious that more and more people were getting the right to vote, that there were fewer and fewer limitations on the suffrage. And Jackson shows what that's going to do to politics. You can't have that stuffy old politics anymore of like James Madison or even a Thomas Jefferson. You instead need to have politicians who can speak to the people, can speak the people's language. And that may mean that politics is getting a little rougher, and it may mean that it's going to be a little bit less elite, and maybe not so much about ideas. But it is definitely going to be more democratic. And Jackson lives that and is the best recipient of that. So, turns out that Jacksonian democracy has a little bit of a pun in it because Jackson is also going to be the founder of the Democratic Party, but we'll save that for the next class. So, Andrew Jackson, he's on your $20 bill. Think about that the next time you get to an ATM machine, which may be months from now. Next time you see an actual $20 bill in your hand, look at the guy on the front of it. It's Andrew Jackson, which is so weird because Jackson hated banks and hated paper currency, and yet his face is popping constantly out of those ATM machines and the side of those banks. He must be rolling over in his grave. All right, Jackson is not like previous presidents. Next class, we're going to pick up the guy who comes after him as a way to wrap up some important other themes of the Jacksonian era. I will see you then. Thank you for your patience, and I'll see you on Tuesday. Good night.